For 60 years, no one in the village of Harlan Creek died in the winter due to wild animals, hunger, or a snowstorm. Not once. While nearby towns continued to report missing people year after year, Harlan Creek paid its own price for peace. Every generation, the village's old women chose a young girl and led her to the edge of the woods on the first frost night, leaving her there for 3 days before bringing her home. No girl had the option to refuse. Nobody explained why, not even to their husbands or children later in life. Clara Holt, an 18-year-old girl, was chosen in 1923. She returned, and 9 months later, she gave birth to a baby girl unlike any other in the village. If you believe that secret agreements with a Bigfoot who rules the deep woods still exist today, please leave your city's name below. I would really like to know who is walking with this channel tonight. Victor here again with Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Here, I share the tales of the deep wood born of imagination to keep the emotions of the people at the center alive. Tonight's story comes from Josephine Calder, who kept it to herself for 40 years before deciding that it was time for someone else to hear it. Don't forget to hit subscribe and walk with me now into that frost-covered night. Josephine Calder returned to Harlan Creek on an October afternoon in 1983 after a call from her mother saying Grandma Clara only had a few days left. She drove 4 hours from Charleston through twisting mountain roads that grew narrower the deeper she went into Appalachia, until the last phone signal finally disappeared behind her somewhere near the county line. Harlan Creek wasn't the kind of place people pass through by accident. It was the kind of place you only went to when you had a reason, and Josie's reason that day was the heaviest reason a person could carry. Josie was 24 years old, newly finished with graduate school in social work at a university in the city. Through her whole childhood, she had grown up hearing about Clara Holt as a living legend of the village. Not in the loose way people use that phrase for respected old folks in a small community. Clara was a legend in the literal sense, a woman whose life story had become part of the way Harlan Creek understood itself. She had buried her husband, Thomas Holt, in 1968 after a sudden heart attack while he was fixing the fence behind the house. She had raised 5 children in a 2-bedroom cabin that didn't have electricity until 1960, when the power lines finally reached that remote valley. And for 20 years after Thomas died, she lived alone in that house at the end of the trail that carried the village's own name, without once, according to Josie's mother, complaining about loneliness or asking her children and grandchildren to visit more often. When Josie stepped into the house that afternoon, the first thing that struck her wasn't the smell of medicine or sickness people often notice in the home of someone close to death. It was the familiar smell of old pine boards, apple butter warming on the wood stove, and a whole lifetime held inside 4 plain wooden walls. Clara lay in the bed in the main bedroom, the same room where she had slept for 60 years since her wedding day. Aunt Ruth, Clara's youngest daughter, sat beside the bed, reading the Bible in a low, sad voice. When Ruth saw Josie, she stood up and held Niece for a long time without saying anything, her eyes red from days of crying. Then she quietly left, so grandmother and granddaughter could be alone together in the small room filled with oil lamp light. Clara's house was full of the things of a slow and careful life, where everything had its own place and meaning. Quilts she had sewn herself from old pieces of clothing that once belonged to her children and grandchildren were folded neatly over the arm of a faded chair worn down by time. Jars of apple butter, wild strawberry preserves, and homemade pickles stood in careful rows on the kitchen shelves, arranged by year in an order only Clara could remember, each jar labeled by hand with the date it was sealed. And on the living room wall, along the hallway leading to the bedroom, family photographs hung in order of time, from an old black-and-white wedding picture of Clara and Thomas in 1902 to her color pictures of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them forming a visible stream of family history stretching almost 6 decades. When Josie was a child, she had walked down that hallway many times during summer visits at her grandmother's house, and she had always noticed a strange empty space on the wall right between the wedding photograph from 1925 and the photograph of the first child, marked in Clara's handwriting as born in 1927. Marked between that patch of wall was slightly different from the rest. A little brighter, as if the paint there had never been faded by sunlight through the decades the way the wall around it had. It was the clear mark of a frame that had hung there for a very long time before being taken down and never replaced with anything else. As a little girl, Josie had once asked her mother about that empty space during a visit to Grandma Clara's house, and her mother had only shrugged and said it was probably an old photograph that had been damaged and thrown away long ago. Even as a child, Josie could feel how thin that answer was, and she understood the adults in the house didn't want to say more. She learned not to ask a second time. On Josie's first night staying to care for Paul, after Ruth and the other relatives had gone back to their own homes in the village, she searched through the drawers of the dresser beside the bed, looking for a clean cloth to wipe Clara's forehead. Clara had a mild fever and, from time to time, murmured unclear words in her broken sleep. The top drawer was full of embroidered handkerchiefs, some so old they had turned yellow with time, all folded neatly into small stacks. But when Josie pulled open the bottom drawer, she felt something raised beneath the cloth lining at the bottom, a lining Clara must have sewn and placed there herself a long time ago, maybe decades earlier. Josie lifted the lining carefully and found a small wooden box, no bigger than a hardcover book, tied shut with a leather cord that had grown faded and stiff with age. The knot was tight, clearly not meant to be opened easily. She did not open it right away. Part of that came from a natural respect for another person's private things, but a larger part was because Clara moved at that exact moment and woke up. Her eyes were cloudy with age, but they held a surprising alertness compared with the way Ruth had described her condition over the phone these last few days. Clara saw the box in her granddaughter's hands, and instead of looking shocked or upset the way Josie feared, she only nodded slowly, as if she had known this would happen, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time without realizing she was waiting. "Set it down there, sweetheart," Clara said, her voice weak but unusually clear compared with what Ruth had said about her confusion over the past few days. "Tonight I need to talk to you. Only you. No one else in our family can know what I'm about to tell, not before you do. Not your mother, not Ruth." Josie set the wooden box on the bedside table, pulled her chair closer, and took her grandmother's wrinkled hand. That hand, though much weaker now with age, still held a certain firmness, as if 80 years of work and raising children had carved a strength into every vein and joint that time couldn't fully erase. "Grandma, are you all right? Should I call Dr. Whitfield?" Josie asked. Though she knew, in some way, the question wasn't truly about Clara's physical condition. It was a natural reaction to the tension rising inside her. Clara gave a small shake of her head, slight but final. "A doctor can't help with what I'm about to tell you, sweetheart. This is something I need you to hear before I go." She paused, took a long and difficult breath, her chest rising slowly under the thin blanket, then continued. "I've kept this for 60 years. I think it's time someone in our family knows the truth, and I'm choosing you, because you're the only one among my grandchildren and great-grandchildren curious enough to never let this story die with me and lie quiet in the ground." Josie felt a vague uneasiness work its way into her chest, a feeling she couldn't name exactly, but heavy in the way truly important instincts often feel in moments like that. Her grandmother had told her hundreds of stories through her childhood. Stories about old winters when snow rose halfway up the windows, about market days in the village when people traded eggs for cloth, about how Thomas had courted her by fixing her porch roof without being asked. But Clara had never, not even once, mentioned a name Josie faintly remembered hearing someone whisper at a family funeral many years earlier. when she was still a child, standing behind her mother's legs in a crowd of adults dressed in black. That name was Wren. Josie didn't clearly remember the setting of that day. She only remembered two old women standing a few steps away, whispering to each other in careful, worried voices, and one of them said that name before noticing a child nearby and going quiet at once, the two women glancing at each other as if something forbidden had slipped out. Josie had asked her mother about that name later, on the drive home, and her mother, just like when Josie asked about the empty space on the wall, only said it was probably the name of some distant relative who had died long ago. The answer was so vague that it only kept Josie's curiosity burning quietly for years without ever giving it a proper place to go. Now, sitting beside her grandmother's bed, on what might be the last night of a life that had lasted almost 80 years, Josie felt as if she were standing at the edge of that very empty space. The lighter patch of wall. The name cut short in a whisper all the scattered pieces of a secret her family and had kept together in silence through 6 long decades. "Grandma," Josie said, her voice soft but unable to hide the tremble rising in it. "Does this have something to do with someone named Wren?" Clara looked at her granddaughter for a long time. Those cloudy eyes seemed to brighten a little, not from surprise, but from something close to the deep relief of a person finally setting down a weight carried for too long. "So you still remember that name," she said, almost in a whisper. "I wondered if anyone still did after all these years." She squeezed Josie's hand with the little strength she had left, and outside the window, the darkness of the woods, behind the house, the same woods Clara had lived beside her whole life since she was a young girl, grew thicker by the minute, as if the forest itself were listening to what was about to be spoken in that small, warm room. That night, after Josie had set the wooden box aside and carefully pulled the blanket back over Clara, Clara began to tell the story. Her voice broke from fatigue, and sometimes she had to stop to catch her breath, her hands trembling lightly on the thin blanket. But the clarity of someone who had prepared these words for a long time never left her. Maybe she had prepared them years before, only waiting for the right person and the right moment, as if this story had been sitting inside her chest, waiting for a door to open. She told Josie about Harlan Creek in 1923, a small village deep in an Appalachian valley, where the hills around it rose so steeply that in winter, sunlight only touched the valley floor for a few hours each day. Winter came early there, often by the middle of October, and stayed long, sometimes all the way until the end of April, covering the only trails that connected the village to the outside world, with snow up to a person's knees. The people of Harlan Creek mostly lived by logging for a timber company, based in a larger town 30 miles away, and by growing corn and beans on steep hillsides, where farming took the strength of the whole family, even the children, as soon as they were big enough to hold a small hoe. From the time Clara was a child of 7 or 8, she knew there was something the adults in the village called the duty. It wasn't a word spoken out loud at family meals, or taught openly in the village's little church, where the pastor preached every Sunday about the familiar commandments of the Bible. It was only mentioned in whispers, usually among the older women when they gathered to wash clothes by the creek, or sat together sewing during long winter afternoons, whenever a girl in the village had just passed her 18th birthday. And it always came with a loaded look passed between the women speaking, as if they were sharing a common burden they didn't need to explain to one another. A quiet understanding rooted deep in the way they saw the world. No one explained to Clara or to any other child in the village what that duty truly was. People only knew from scattered pieces, picked up from conversations not meant for children's ears, from sentences cut short when someone noticed a child listening, that about once every 20 to 25 years, nearly once a generation, the old women of the village, a group quietly known as the council, would gather and speak in total secrecy inside a small house at the edge of the village where no one else was allowed to enter during those meetings. Then they would choose a girl. After being chosen, that girl would disappear from the village for 3 straight nights, then return, and after that, no one was allowed to ask what she had gone through. It was an unwritten rule, but people obeyed it more strictly than any official law in the village. Clara remembered that when she was young, every now and then a girl in the village would suddenly be gone for a few days. And when she came back, she would carry something different, a new silence in her eyes that hadn't been there before. None of the children in the village, Clara included, ever dared ask directly what had happened, because they had learned almost by instinct that there were questions you never asked in Harlan Creek. Curiosity about the duty was a forbidden thing, worked deep into the life of the whole community, passed from one generation to the next, not through direct teaching, but through the silence that fell every time the subject was accidentally touched. Clara was chosen on a late October evening in 1923. Only 2 weeks after her 18th birthday, a birthday she remembered being marked modestly with a cornbread cake and a few neighbors coming by to offer good wishes. She had no idea that the old clock of an ancient ritual had begun to run. Dorothea Pruitt, the elder of the council at that time, a woman past 70, with white hair always pinned neatly at the back of her head, and sharp gray eyes that made every child in the village go quiet, when she appeared on the road, came to Clara's house at dusk, when the last light of the day was fading behind the western ridges. She didn't knock, she only waited on the porch, silent and still like a stone statue. Until Clara's mother, sensing that presence through the kitchen window where she was washing dishes, came to open the door with a slowness that made Clara, sitting near the fireplace sewing, feel that something wrong was hanging in the air. Dorothea said only one sentence, short and needing no explanation, her voice flat as if she were reading a line that had been repeated countless times through many decades. "It's the girl's turn." Clara's mother, as Clara told Josie that night, did not cry. She did not argue. She did not ask a single question, though her shoulders lowered slightly for one brief moment, so brief only Clara, standing nearby, could notice it. She only nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for that sentence for a very long time, maybe since the day Clara was born, maybe from the very moment she knew she was carrying a baby girl. Then she turned back into the house and brought out a cloth bag that had already been prepared. Hanging in a hidden corner of the bedroom, a corner Clara had never noticed until that night, even though she had lived in that house for all 18 years of her life. Inside the bag was enough dry food for 3 days, hard cornbread and salted meat, wrapped carefully in cloth, a thick wool blanket to stem the cold of an October night in the woods, and a separate small pouch of cornmeal, tied tightly with twine. Something Clara would only understand later was not meant for her to eat, but to offer as a gift to something she had never known existed. "And tumute," Clara said. She stood there in the doorway of her own home, watching her mother prepare that bag with a calm that felt almost frightening. Clara later understood that calm wasn't coldness. It was a kind of acceptance shaped by years of living under the shadow of this ritual. And the first feeling that took hold of Clara was not panic or rebellion. It was a deep loneliness, the feeling of a child realizing that the whole world around her, even the mother, who had given birth to her and raised her for 18 years, had known this was coming, and none of them meant to stop it, or even simply comfort her before she had to face the unknown. Clara was led to the edge of the woods that same night. They did not wait until morning, as she had imagined in one last innocent moment, thinking maybe she would have time to prepare her mind. Dorothea and 2 other old women from the council walked with her, their faces only faintly known to Clara in the oil lantern light they carried, because they lived on the other side of the village, and Clara rarely saw them in ordinary life. They followed a narrow path that did not appear on any village map, a path clearly known and used only by the women of the council, maybe there for many generations, kept secret just like the ritual it led to. The path went past harvested cornfields, where dry stalks rattled in the night wind, through a thin stretch of woods where old oaks stood quietly in the dark like silent guards, and finally stopped at a large stone as high as a person's chest, its surface covered with dark green moss. That stone marked the clear border between the village farmland and the untouched old forest beyond it, where no one in Harlan Creek, not even the most seasoned hunters raised in those mountains, dared go too far past a certain distance. At that stone, Dorothea placed the pouch of cornmeal on a flat rock at the base of the larger stone, with clear care and ritual in every movement. Then she whispered something, a string of sounds Clara did not recognize as any language she had ever heard, with a strange rise and fall like an old prayer passed down through generations, the original meaning may be long forgotten, leaving only sound and ritual behind. After that, without one word of goodbye, without a hug or a squeeze of the hand for courage, the three old women turned and walked away, taking the lantern light with them as it faded into the dark. They left Clara standing there alone as the night grew thicker, with her small cloth bag and a black stretch of forest spread out in front of her, so quiet she could hear the hard beat of her own pulse. Josie sat frozen as she listened, both hands holding tightly to her grandmother's hand, trying to imagine what it felt like to be an 18-year-old girl, only 6 years younger than Josie was now, standing alone at the edge of the wood in the dark, left there by her own family. With no explanation, no preparation, only a cloth bag and one short sentence from an old woman she barely knew. "Were you afraid?" Josie asked, her voice so soft it was almost only a breath, afraid that speaking louder might break the thin air around the room. Clara looked out the window, where the darkness of the woods behind the house, the woods she had chosen to live beside her whole life even though she could have moved away, after marrying Thomas, was growing thicker by the minute, like a black velvet curtain slowly being pulled down over a stage. "I was afraid," she said, her voice light as smoke fading in the air. "I was so afraid I couldn't cry, child. There are fears so large they swallow your tears before you can shed them. Do you know what I mean?" She said that night was colder than she had expected, the kind of October cold that settles in the Appalachian Mountains when dampness rises from the ground and mixes with cold air into a thin mist that lies low over the grass. Clara sat curled beside the stone, the wool blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, trying not to think about the far sounds coming from deep inside the forest. An owl calling, a branch breaking somewhere far away. The normal sounds of woods at night, made many times more frightening because of where she was. She sat like that for hours, not daring to close her eyes, staring into the darkness ahead, both hands gripping the edge of the blanket, as if that were the only thing still giving her any feeling of safety. "Did your mother look back at you, even once, before she left?" Josie asked, her voice tight with deep sympathy for the grandmother she had never known at 18. Clara slowly shook her head. "My mother didn't look back, child. I remember that very clearly because I hoped so hard that she would turn her head for even 1 second, just so I'd know she was still thinking of me while she walked away." She let out a long breath, heavy enough to still carry the disappointment of that night after 60 years. But she didn't. Maybe she didn't dare. Maybe if she had looked back, she wouldn't have had the courage to keep walking home. Outside the window, the night wind slipped through the worn wooden frame, carrying the first cold of the season into the small room, and Josie pulled the blanket up around her grandmother. Then she waited in silence, giving Clara time to gather her strength before moving into the next part of the story. The part Josie could feel, from the look in Clara's eyes, would be far harder to tell. Clara stopped for a long while after telling Josie about that first night being left behind, as if she were asking herself whether she had enough strength to go on. Then she gave Josie's hand a light squeeze and said the next part of this story had never been told fully to anyone, not even Thomas, the husband who had shared her bed for 43 years until the day he died. "Some things," she said, "a woman keeps back not because she is ashamed, but because she has never found enough words to describe them without making the listener misunderstand what truly happened." Close to midnight that night, when the small fire Clara had built from the last matches in her bag had burned down to red coals, and when her body ached from sitting curled up too long in the same position, she heard the first sound coming from deep in the woods. It wasn't the hurried, panicked footfalls of an animal running away or chasing prey. The kind of sound Clara had known since childhood from growing up in a village beside the forest. This was different, slow, heavy. The sound of great weight moving through dry leaves without hurry, as if whoever made it knew the whole night belonged to them. Clara said she sat frozen, afraid to move, her pulse beating so hard she thought the sound might carry out into the trees. She stared into the dark spaces between the trunks, where the sound was coming closer little by little, and only one thought kept repeating in her mind. This is what the whole village knew about, and no one told me. Sorrel stepped out of the dark at just the right distance for the last glow of Clara's fire to reach him, and Clara described that shape to Josie with such exact detail that her granddaughter couldn't doubt it was a real memory, kept whole across 60 years, not a story polished, and changed over time the way folk legends often become, after being told too many times. He stood more than 7 feet tall when fully upright, taller than any man Clara had ever seen in the village, even Mr. Higgins, the blacksmith, whose size made children stare whenever he walked past. Sorrel's body was covered in reddish-brown fur, the same color as maple leaves in late fall, right before they drop for good, a warmth of color Clara had never expected from someone she had been taught to fear. The fur was thickest across his shoulders and upper back, forming a heavy wall of muscle, then grew thinner along his long arms so long his hands nearly reached his knees when he stood straight. Clara called him Sorrel because of that fur color, the name of a plant with similar leaves that grew along the creek near her childhood home. That was the name she gave him herself, because the Bigfoot, or the man, or the living being, Clara never knew which word was right, had made a sound to name himself on one of the nights that followed. It was a low sound with a strange rhythm, something no human throat could truly copy. Clara said she tried many times over the years, but she could never make it right, so in the end she kept the name she had chosen for him. Sorrel did not come close to Clara on that first night. He stopped about 20 feet away, then slowly lowered his huge weight and squatted on the ground in a posture that reminded Clara of an old soldier keeping watch at night. He faced the edge of the woods behind Clara as if he was guarding something, not hunting her. He stayed there through the whole night, not moving, not making another sound, only a shadow larger than the other shadows around him, present but not threatening. Clara said she drifted off several times that night, though she tried hard to stay awake. Each bit of sleep lasted only a few minutes before the cold or some small sound from the woods snapped her awake again. When the first light of morning began working through the trees, Clara woke fully from one of those broken sleeps and found that Sorrel was gone, vanished into the deep woods without a trace, as if he had never been there. But beside the place where she sat, on a large leaf laid down carefully, were a few wild chestnuts, already peeled, arranged in a neat little row, as if someone had taken time and care to prepare them while Clara slept. On the second night, when darkness settled again, and Clara once more sat curled beside the stone with the small fire made from her remaining matches, Sorrel appeared earlier, just as night came down, and this time he came much closer than before. Clara said her body went tight when she saw the distance between them closing, but Sorrel made no threatening move. He did not touch her. He did not growl or show any sign of anger. He simply sat down closer to her, close enough that Clara could feel warmth coming from his huge body, a steady heat that pushed back some of the sharp cold seeping through her thin wool blanket. Clara told Josie that on that second night, for the first time since being left at the edge of the woods, she did not feel afraid anymore. In its place came a strange feeling, a feeling of being protected that she had not felt since her father died when she was only 12, in a logging accident that took away the only man who had ever made her feel completely safe in the world. She said there was something in Sorrel's quiet and patient presence, in the way he chose to stay near her without asking anything from her. That brought back exactly that feeling, the feeling of a child sitting beside her father by the fire, knowing nothing in the world could hurt her as long as he was there. You weren't afraid of him anymore, even though he was that big, even though you didn't know anything about him? Josie asked, her voice carrying both curiosity and doubt, trying to make the frightening image she had always imagined fit with what her grandmother was describing. Clara slowly shook her head. The fear didn't disappear completely, child, but it changed shape. At first, I was afraid he would hurt me. By the second night, I understood that fear didn't make sense anymore, because if he had wanted to hurt me, he had more than enough chances and more than enough strength to do it on the first night, when I couldn't defend myself at all. Instead, he chose to keep his distance, then chose to come closer slowly, as if he was giving me time to get used to him. Time to understand he wasn't a threat. She paused, her eyes looking far away, as if she were seeing that moment again. I think by the second night my fear had become something close to curiosity, and after that, something close to a kind of trust I never thought I could give to a being like him. Josie stayed quiet for a while, trying to rearrange the pictures forming in her mind as the story slowly opened in front of her. Then she asked, more carefully this time, "Then what about the third night, Grandma? What happened on that last night?" For the first time since Clara had begun telling her story that evening, she remained quiet for a long time before answering. The silence stretched long enough for Josie to wonder whether her grandmother still had the strength to continue, or whether this was the line Clara did not plan to cross, even after promising to tell her granddaughter the truth. At last, Clara spoke, her voice smaller and slower, carrying a different weight from everything she had said before. "There are things, Josie, that a woman carries through her whole life without needing to turn them into words for anyone, not even the people she loves most. I think that third night is one of those things." She held Josie's hand tighter, as if to make sure her next words could not be misunderstood. "But there is one thing I want you to understand, and I want you to understand it clearly before I go. What happened that night was not a taking. It was not what you may be thinking right now. It was not violence, and it was not force, with me as some helpless victim." She stopped and took a long, difficult breath. Her eyes held Josie's with a steadiness her granddaughter had not seen at any other point that evening. "It was a choice, child. Real choice, though I know that may sound hard to believe, after the way I was brought there and left there, without anyone ever asking me whether I agreed to the ritual at all. But by the third night, after 2 nights with Sorrel, I was no longer the terrified girl who had been forced there on the first night. I had time to watch him, to understand some part of what he was, and when the third night came, what happened between me and him was something I accepted, something I chose in that moment, in my own way, inside the limits of my own circumstances." Josie felt tears rise at the corners of her eyes, not from fear or disgust at what her grandmother had just revealed, but from a difficult understanding slowly forming inside her, an understanding of the weight this small woman lying in the sickbed had carried for 60 years. Clara had been forced to build meaning out of an experience no one had prepared her for, no one had asked her about, and yet somehow she had found a way to turn it into something she could live with, something she could carry without letting it destroy her completely. Clara returned to the village on the 4th morning, alone, walking back along the same familiar trail she had been led down 4 nights earlier. Her steps were slow but steady, as if nothing strange had just happened in her life. Clara said that during that whole walk, from the edge of the woods back to the little house where she had grown up, she tried to arrange everything she had just lived through into something she could carry without falling apart. And by the time she saw the familiar roof appear beyond the trees, she had decided she would walk into that house with her head held high, even if everything inside her was still tangled and raw. Clara's mother was already waiting at the door, as if she knew the exact hour her daughter would return. though there was no way she could truly know it for certain. She looked into Clara's eyes for a long time. A searching look, but not a judging one. The look of someone trying to read what her daughter had been through without asking out loud. Then she held Clara in her arms, a tight, long embrace, longer than any Clara could remember from before. But no question was spoken. No comfort was offered. No curiosity was shown. The whole village acted the same way. In the days and weeks that followed, as Clara slowly returned to ordinary work, going to the market, drawing water from the shared well, seeing familiar neighbors, no one asked what had happened during those 3 nights. Some of the older women looked at her with a little more softness, a quiet understanding for someone who had completed the duty that they, or their mothers, or their grandmothers, had also once carried. But no one said a word. That, Clara told Josie, was the greatest unwritten rule in all of life in Harlan Creek, and it was followed more strictly than the commandments preached in church every Sunday. 9 months after the last night at the edge of the woods, on a late July morning in 1924, Clara gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Wren, after the small bird that often nested in the thick bushes around Clara's childhood home, a bird Clara had always admired for its stubborn will to live, even with its tiny size and plain appearance. From the first weeks after the birth, the village midwife, Agnes Whitfield, who was also a member of the council, noticed clear differences in the child. Wren's arm and leg bones were much thicker than those of other newborns. Agnes had delivered over decades of work, an unusual firmness that made Agnes look again and again to be sure her eyes weren't fooling her. The soft, downy hair that covers most newborns and usually falls away in the first weeks of life was thicker on Wren's back, darker, and showed no sign of fading even when the baby was several months old. But what caught Agnes and the other women's attention most was Wren's eyes. Just like Clara's eyes, after her 3 nights at the edge of the woods, something Clara herself noticed when she first looked in a mirror. After coming home, Wren's eyes had a faint amber ring around the dark center. No other child in the village had it so clearly, not even the children born to women who had gone through the same ritual in earlier generations. The village accepted Wren without one open word of gossip, though Clara was sure that behind closed doors, behind family suppers, people must have whispered about this special child. But in public, no one judged. No one murmured when Clara carried Wren past them. No child was forbidden by their parents from playing with her because she was different. This was something Clara stressed to Josie with complete certainty, as if she had thought about it for 60 years and reached a conclusion that could not be shaken. That silence, she said, did not come from fear or shame toward Wren or Clara. It came from a much deeper understanding, one every woman in the village carried inside her, whether she had ever been chosen or not. Wren, the fact that she existed, was part of the price that had kept Harlan Creek safe through so many hard winters, away from the disasters the nearby villages still suffered. No one wanted to break that fragile balance with selfish curiosity. 2 years after Wren was born, Clara married Thomas Holt, a young carpenter from the village, tall and quiet, with hands hardened by work but always gentle whenever they touched anything he loved. Thomas knew about Wren. He knew about the ritual night Clara had gone through, because that was something every man in the village quietly understood when he came of age, a part of the shared inheritance they had to accept if they wanted to keep living in that community. But Thomas never, not once in all 43 years of their marriage, asked Clara for any more details about what had happened during those 3 nights. He treated Wren as his own daughter, taught her how to carve wood, taught her how to recognize trees in the forest, and loved her with the same love he later gave their other children. Clara and Thomas had 4 more children in the years that followed, all of them completely ordinary in a biological sense, with none of the differences their oldest sister carried. Among them was a son, born in 1931, who would later become Josie's father, and who grew up with a special love for his unusual older sister without ever questioning where those differences came from. "So how did Wren grow up? Was she happy, Grandma?" Josie asked, her voice carrying honest worry for the aunt she had never met, the aunt whose existence she had only now learned about. Clara smiled, a real and warm smile that rarely appeared on her wrinkled face during that heavy night of storytelling. She was happy, child, in her own way. Wren grew up different, yes, but she was never thrown away or pushed aside in this village. The whole community, in a quiet way, I only fully understood many years later, protected and raised her together, as if Wren was everyone's shared responsibility, not only mine. Clara said Wren grew strong and quick, stronger than the children her own age, with a physical power she learned to control carefully so she would not hurt anyone during childhood games. She had a special bond with the forest, often disappearing in the afternoons to walk alone among the trees, then coming home with her eyes bright in a joy Clara didn't fully understand, but always knew was real. When Wren turned 16, those afternoon walks began lasting longer, sometimes for several days at a time. At first, Clara and Thomas worried during those early hours, but little by little they learned to accept it, because Wren always came home safely, even though she spoke less and less about where she had gone and what she had done during those days away. Clara said she asked her daughter a few times at first, but Wren only smiled, a smile both gentle and far away, and said there were places in the woods meant only for her, places even the most loving mother could not follow. Did you ever ask her who she met in the woods? Did you ever think Wren had found her father? Josie asked, her voice trembling with curiosity and with a faint fear of the answer coming next. Clara slowly nodded. I knew, child, I knew very early, even though Wren never said it plainly. There were small signs, the kind of things only a mother would notice. The strange scent that sometimes stayed on her clothes when she came back, the way her eyes lit up whenever the woods behind the house were mentioned. Though, way on full moon nights, she often stood quietly by the window, looking into the dark as if she were waiting for some signal only she could recognize. When Wren turned 20 on a late fall night in 1944, she left the house after supper as she often did, saying she would only walk for a little while and come back. But that night, Wren did not return. Not for a day, not for a week, never. Clara said she did not panic when she realized this long absence was different from the others, a calmness that even surprised Thomas at the time. Deep down I knew that day would come, Josie, Clara said, her voice carrying an acceptance shaped through years of thought. The way a mother knows a young bird must finally leave the nest and fly, no matter how much her heart hurts when the moment truly comes. Only Wren's nest wasn't any place I could see or reach. It was somewhere deep in these mountains, somewhere no human trail could ever lead, another world entirely, one she belonged to more than she belonged to mine. Josie sat still, trying to picture the pain of a mother forced to accept losing her first child in a way unlike any ordinary loss. Not death, not leaving through marriage or work, but a complete disappearance into another world, where that mother knew her child was still alive, still happy in her own way, but forever beyond reach. For 60 years after that ritual night, Clara said she never once missed going back to the stone at the edge of the woods on the first frost night of every fall, no matter the weather, no matter her health, no matter what other burdens life had placed on her at the time. She always went alone, never allowing Thomas or any of her other children to follow, carrying a small pouch of cornmeal carefully prepared just the way her mother had prepared it on that fateful night in 1923. As a private ritual, Clara chose to keep for the rest of her life. She did not always meet anyone there. Some years, she sat beside the stone all night, listening to the wind in the leaves, the insects crying in the dark, with no sign that anyone was listening or watching from the other side of the border between the human world and the old forest. But every few years, sometimes 5 years apart, sometimes close to a decade, when she returned to the stone the next morning to take back the cloth bag she had left the night before, she would find something placed beside it. Small signs, but enough to keep a thin line of hope alive inside her for decades. Once it was a large feather, reddish-brown, exactly the color of Sorrel's fur as she still remembered it after all those years, placed neatly on the flat stone where her mother had once set down the pouch of cornmeal as an offering. Another time, it was a small stone carved with a simple shape, rough but clear lines, forming what looked like a face, perhaps the face of a woman, though Clara was never completely sure what it meant. And once, the one that made Clara's chest tighten with feeling, it was a small bundle of herbs, tied neatly with forest vine. The plant Clara recognized at once as cough medicine. The very plant she had taught Wren to know and pick when the girl was still a toddler taking her first steps in the garden behind the house. On that final night, when Clara's breathing had grown weaker and more broken, and the oil lamp in the room had burned low, throwing long shadows across the walls, Clara slowly reached for the wooden box Josie had found in the dresser drawer at the beginning of the evening. She opened it with trembling fingers. The old leather cord slipped loose more easily than Josie expected, as if it had been opened and tied shut again countless times across those 60 years. Inside the box were 3 small things, each carrying an emotional weight Josie could not measure right away. The first was a small piece of wood, hand-carved, rough, but surprisingly careful, showing the shape of a woman holding a child in her arms, with details carved down to the folds of the dress and the curve of the hair. The second was a reddish-brown feather, faded and brittle with age, but still whole in shape, placed carefully inside a thin cloth lining in the box. And the third, the thing that made Josie hold her breath, was a small yellowed piece of paper, folded into 4 parts, with handwriting that was clearly not Clara's. The letters were large and clumsy, the writing of someone just beginning to learn English, not yet used to holding a pencil. On that paper were only 6 short words. "Mother is well." I still remember. Clara said that note came on a spring morning in 1961, 38 years after the fateful ritual night, tucked carefully inside a bundle of wildflowers left right in front of her door. They were flowers Clara recognized at once. Flowers that only grew deep in the old forest, in places no villager ever visited. She had stood frozen in the doorway for a long time, holding that bundle in her hands, reading those 6 short words again and again until her tears blurred the uneven letters. That was the only time, Clara said, her voice shaking with feeling even though so many years had passed since the day she received that note, the only time Wren ever left me something written. Before that and after that, she only left small things, silent signs, but that time she had tried to learn how to write. It must have taken so much time and effort, all just to tell her mother that she was still well, and that she still remembered me. Josie held the paper in her hands, feeling the weight of 38 years of waiting, of a love crossing borders she had never imagined before that night. "Did you ever try to find Aunt Wren? Did you ever want to go deeper into the woods and look for her?" Clara shook her head, a small movement but full of certainty. "No, child, never. I thought about it, especially in the early years after Wren left, when the pain was still fresh and all I wanted was to hold my daughter one more time. But I understood, child. I understood in a way that could only come from what I had lived through with Sorrel long ago." She stopped and drew a hard breath. Sorrel, even in the harshest situation, even though I was brought there without an original choice, still gave me something close to the right to decide on that 3rd night. He didn't force. He waited. He let me come to my own choice. And I think if I had gone looking for Wren, if I had tried to pull her back into my world with the force of a mother's love, then I would have taken away from Wren the very thing Sorrel gave me, the right to choose her own life. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Only the clock on the wall kept ticking, and Clara's breathing came with effort. Then she placed the box in Josie's hands. Her old fingers trembled, but she still tried to close them around her granddaughter's hand with the last bit of strength left in her worn body. "I'm not telling you this story so you'll be afraid, Josie," Clara said, her voice now only a soft breath. "And I'm not telling you so you'll think you have to continue that ritual. The council has been gone since the 1950s. when the last generation of old women who truly knew the rites and the meaning behind them died one by one without passing them on. That duty, child, ended with them. You don't have to carry that burden. She looked into Josie's eyes, the look full of love and pleading. I'm telling you because I want someone in our family to know Wren existed, that she was a real part of this family, not some shameful secret that needed to be buried forever. I want you to know the 60 years of peace Harlan Creek had were not some lucky accident. A real price was paid for it by women like me, in ways the outside world may never understand or accept. She tightened her hand around Josie's a little more. And most of all, I want you to understand that a mother's love for her child, no matter what world that child belongs to, no matter how different she is from what the world calls normal, is never smaller than the love I had for my other children. Wren was my daughter Josie, just as your father was my son, and that love never faded, not for one moment, through all 60 years. Clara Holt died at 4 o'clock the next morning, peacefully in her sleep, with her hand still lightly holding her granddaughter's hand. Josie later said that every year since that night, on the first frost night of fall, she still drives back to Harlan Creek, goes to the stone at the edge of the woods where her family's story began almost a century earlier, and leaves a small pouch of cornmeal there, even though she is never sure whether anyone is still there. Mountains, deep in those mountains, to receive it. That is what happened to the village of Harlan Creek. It gives you a cold feeling, doesn't it? While shaping this story, one question kept sitting in my mind. Why did not one woman in those 60 years ever say no? I don't think the answer is fear, even though that is what I first believed when I began writing. If you listen closely, Clara never described her mother as someone forcing her daughter into sacrifice out of terror. She described a silence that had been prepared in advance, a cloth bag already packed, as if that whole community had found a way to turn something frightening into a ritual they could endure, by making sure no one ever had to say out loud what it truly was. Maybe that is what haunts me most, even more than the image of Sorrel stepping out of the dark. Not a monster in the woods, but the way people learn to live beside something they cannot control through a shared silence carried across generations. That makes me think of something in community psychology called silent intergenerational trauma, when a family or a community passes down the emotional weight of a painful event, not through stories, but through the absence of stories. Children grow up sensing that something heavy exists, even though no one ever tells them what it is, just like the strangely bright empty patch Josie noticed on Clara's wall when she was a child, an empty space she herself did not know how to name. What is interesting is that communities like this often survive for a very long time, sometimes for centuries, exactly because silence in some cases is the only way a group can carry a truth too large for any one person to carry alone. But I don't think that is the whole story, because if it were only silence and endurance, Clara would not have kept that wooden box for 60 years. She would not have returned to the stone every fall, no matter the rain or wind. She would not have saved every feather as if it were a letter sent home from a very far place. She did those things for a very human reason, much simpler than any ritual or curse. She was a mother, and Wren, even if she belonged to another world, was still her daughter. In the end, this is not just a story about a village paying a price for safety. It is a story about how a mother's love can cross the line between two species, two worlds, and even 60 years of silence without fading at all. I want to leave you with another way of seeing this story, not from Clara's eyes or Josie's eyes, but from Wren's. Imagine growing up in a village where everyone knows what made you, but no one ever says it to you directly. You are loved, protected, and quietly sheltered by a whole community, but you always feel like you are standing on the edge of two worlds without fully belonging to either one. Then one fall night at 20 years old, you walk into the woods and do not come back. I wonder, was that an escape? Or was it the first time in your life you found the place where you could be fully yourself, without explaining, without apologizing for existing, without standing between two worlds anymore, because you finally chose one? I do not have a final answer to that question, and I think Clara, while she was alive, never had one either, even after 60 years to think about it. Maybe that is why she never went looking for her daughter deeper in the woods. Even though a mother's heart must have pushed her toward it more times than anyone could count. She understood, in the way only mothers understand, that sometimes loving someone means letting them choose their own path, even when that path leads to a place you can never follow, a place outside the reach of even the strongest love. I want to ask you something before we close tonight's story, and this question is not about the deep woods or Bigfoot. Does your family carry a silence like that? Something everyone knows, but no one ever says out loud, passed down from one generation to the next, only by not speaking of it, by an empty space on a wall, by a name that is not mentioned. If so, leave a comment, no matter how short, even if you do not want to share the details. I believe many families, not only in Harlan Creek, carry their own little wooden boxes, hidden at the bottom of some drawer, waiting for the right person and the right time to be opened. Every bargain has a price. If you carried the blood of a dark agreement like that, would you choose to stay silent or step into the light? Remember to hit subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories, so we can keep uncovering the most haunting mysteries buried beneath the trees. Thank you for walking this trail with me tonight. I'm Victor. I'll see you again.